Welcome back to my Making Browser Games tutorial series, and today we're going to be finally improving upon the number guessing game. So from the last video, we made this okay number guessing game website where we get to enter a guess, get some feedback, and we learned about adding feedback on the web page so we don't have to use it through console.log. Now the only problem we found with this code last time is once you get the guess correct, you still have a certain amount of guesses left. And in fact, no matter how you play this game, our for loop sets the timeout of the guess function 6 different times, and we're stuck with exactly 6 different guesses no matter what. And so we have no way of ending this game early if we actually get the guess correct. And so with that, we're going to learn a much better way of getting user input that is not this prompt text box here. We're going to learn to use HTML forms to be able to type in on a text box in the page and process input from that. To do that, I'm going to go over to the code and we're going to start with the HTML. I'm going to keep all the HTML here that's already here because all that's good. I'm going to add a form element. I'm going to type form and then a closing form tag here because I need to create a form tag first in order to actually put a text box on the web page that I can use. Now to create a text box, I'm going to add an input tag, but the input tag needs a type attribute. When I say attribute, that's any of these things that appear inside of the HTML. ID, I think that's an attribute. Style, I think that's an attribute as well. Any of the word equals something. That's just an attribute of a tag. So I'm going to type input, and I'm going to make its type attribute text. And that is going to create a text box. Now notice there is no closing input tag. There is no slash input at the end. That is not necessary for this tag because there is no inner HTML required for the text box. I'm going to refresh the page, and I'm going to refresh the page, I'm also going to comment out the set timeout function so we can just work without worrying about the guesses. So 1, 1, 1. There, it refreshed. There is a text box here. Now notice we need inner HTML for many things, like this H1 here. Well, we need the inner HTML here so that we know what the words are. For the paragraph, we need inner HTML. But for a text box, we do not need any inner HTML. The box is simply there. And for some reason, it is still asking for input. Let me get rid of that. And now let's run it again. And okay, it's gone for good. So we have our form, which is required in order to create our text box. Let's add something else to the text box. So the text box, you can click it, you can add things to it, but it kind of looks ugly by itself. So let's give it a label so that the user knows what this text box is for. So I'm going to give it a label. You're learning a lot of new tags today. The label tag, it's going to be label, and now this does require inner HTML because we need to know what the words are. Enter your guess here, followed by a closing label tag. And we have enter your guess here. I like a colon. Let's add a colon. Enter your guess here, followed by our text box. Now, something cool that you can do for a label, and this is another use for an ID. Normally, we only use IDs when we're trying to grab that tag in the JavaScript here with document.getElementById. But there's another use for the ID. I can say ID for the input is equal to, let's see, I'm going to call it just text box. That's what the ID of the input is for. Does not actually matter if ID is before or after type. It just works either way. So we added ID. Now I can say this label is for equals text box. So now I just said that this label is specifically for whatever element in this web page has the ID text box, which is this one here. And it doesn't look different, but something different happens. When now you can grab the input for the text box by clicking either on the text box itself or clicking on the label. And it's going to grab the input. I'm going to do it again. I'm going to click on the label, and it grabs the focus of the text box right there. So that's just a random feature for a label. We have our form, we have our label for the text box, we have our text box. Lastly, we need a submit button. You can press enter to submit it, but I want to use a real submit button here. So we're going to use a submit button. To create a submit button, we're also going to use the input tag, but this time the type is going to be submit. And when I do that, a button appears that says submit. I don't want the word submit by default to appear on this button. I want the word guess. So I'm going to type value equals guess. This is yet another HTML attribute we can use. And when I type in guess, there it is. Let's make it a capital G. Value equals guess. That will let us change the words that appear inside the button. And really, besides the value, there is no other inner HTML required. It's just a button. That's why this input does not have a closing input tag. So that concludes the HTML part. Now let's move on to the JavaScript, and I'm going to rewrite. We're going to be rewriting quite a bit of this, but the last video was certainly not wasted. That was the best number guessing game we could make using the prompt function. Now we're going to make a better number guessing game. And I'm going to keep all these variables for now. Actually, time, we are not going to be needing because we're not going to be using set timeouts for any of this. So we do not need time, and I'm going to delete that. And yep, that's all I need to delete. I'm going to delete time. Game over, we're going to keep. Delay, we're also going to delete. We're going to keep the guesses though. So now here's what we're going to do. We need one more variable to keep track of the number of times the user has guessed, and that's because before we were just using a for loop to manage that. The for loop managed the amount of guesses, but since we're not going to be using a for loop, we're going to actually manually have to keep track of the guesses, not just with I. So I'm going to create var guesses and set it to 0. So now we're going to learn about another big thing. Forms are really big with HTML, but now we're going to learn something huge for JavaScript. We're going to learn about event listeners. An event listener is, well, I mean, the name is pretty self-explanatory. It is something that will listen and wait for a certain event. And when we add an event listener to a tag, it's going to perform an action when a certain type of event happens. So if that was kind of confusing, we'll just type out the code here so you can see that. We're going to add an event listener to form. We're going to listen for the submit event. We are adding that event listener to form, and the event listener takes an action. But that's enough explanation. Let's get into the code for it. It'll make more sense if you just see it. So the first thing I need is I actually need to create a form. I need to grab the form and the text box. So let's grab the form by giving it an ID. ID equals form. And the text box already has an ID text box. So let's grab them both. Var form equals document.get element by ID form. Var text box is equal to document.get element by ID text box. So now we've grabbed them both. Let's add an event listener to form. We're going to say form.add event listener. And this is a function that takes two arguments. The first, to create an event listener, you need to specify what kind of event you are listening for. And there's lots of events. There's like a key press, a key down, a key up, a mouse button click, a double click, a mouse over. There's all kinds of events for the web page that you can listen for in JavaScript. So the first thing you do is specify the event. We want the submit event. The second thing is you add a function that needs to happen when this submit is selected. And that's all the event listener is. There's a certain function that we're going to specify here that happens when this event is detected for this tag here. And that's how event listeners work. So we have what we need to do is when we detect a submit event, which is just when the submit button is pressed, we need to start processing the user's guess. But I don't want to use this guess function here. I want to create a new function. I think I've already explained that you can create functions that have no names because you can use them temporarily. I think the name of this is a function template, but I'm creating a function without a name, which means I'm not going to be using it anywhere else in my code, but just for this event listener. So I'm going to add a function, and this function is what's going to execute when this event is detected for this tag. And right now, just pay very close attention. The function's opening curly bracket is here. The function's closing curly bracket is here. The add event listeners function parenthesis starts here, closes here, and is followed by a semicolon. So don't let that confuse you. This is all that it would look like on one line. Submit function, two curly brackets, and then the closing parenthesis and semicolon. I'm simply adding an enter right here so we can type the code. So let's add the code that will happen when the submit event is detected. Let's first just check and make sure we see this console.log event. So if we see event on the console, we know that this event listener worked and we successfully detected this submit event and this function ran. So I'm going to refresh the page. I'm going to open up the console and I'm going to type in, why would I save that? I'm going to type in Q and I'm going to press guess. And we saw very briefly the word event appear on the console. The reason it's disappearing immediately is because this submit button also refreshes the page, which is actually something we're going to have to fix in a second, but for now it's fine. So we know our event listener works. And again, please don't let this syntax confuse you. This is just a function. Its opening parenthesis here, its closing parenthesis here. This function here has an opening curly bracket here, closing curly bracket here. The only reason this looks different is we chose to add extra space. So we know this event listener is working. Now what we need to do is get the guess from the text box. So I'm going to say that the guess is simply equal to no longer prompt, but we're going to say it's equal to the text box dot value. So that means whatever is typed in this text box, that is text box dot value. But the problem is, I believe that comes in as a string. So if I type in 99, I get the string 99. And if I type in 100, I get the string 100. We want the number 100 or the number 99 here. We don't want strings. We don't want the quotation marks. And I'm not entirely sure if this would be a problem, but just to be on the safe side, let's make sure that this guess is an actual number. So I'm going to say guess is equal to number guess. So what this does is if guess is a string, it's going to convert it into a number. If our guess was 33, it's going to convert it to 33. So that's what this function does. So now we have the guess from the user. Now we can do the processing. And for the processing, I'm going to actually steal most of this here. I'm going to cut that code, paste it here. So if the guess is less than a number, we still want the feedback. We're going to do that. If the guess is greater than a number, we're still going to do that. Otherwise, it says you got it. So let's do a test here. Let's just see if we can actually guess the number correctly and see if we get the you got it and stuff like that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to save and we're going to see if we see you got it on the page. I'm going to enter the word of the number 55, which is the correct number because I hard coded the guess to 55. And then once we're done, we can change it back to our random number. So I'm going to refresh, type in 55 and enter guess. And you'll notice we saw the feedback very briefly. We saw the number display here, number display.innerHTML equals number. So we know we got the guess correct, but the problem is this button refreshing the page is actually preventing us from rendering the full HTML. So now we got to handle that. Here's how we're going to keep the Here's how we're going to keep the button from refreshing the page so that we can actually see all this feedback here. I'm going to add a parameter called event to this function, this temporary function, even though it has no name and it's temporary and we can't use it outside of the event listener. We can add a parameter to it, and I'm going to add the event parameter. This is simply a variable with all kinds of data about the event. So if you were listening for a key, like a key down event, you could say, event.key, and that would give you whatever key was pressed. This is just a variable that contains data about the event. But we don't really need any of the data about the event, but what we need is to say event dot prevent default. That is a function that will keep this event from refreshing the page. Whatever this event is, the page will no longer refresh. And because this is a parameter, remember parameters can be named whatever you want. So you can call this E and this E. You can name it whatever you want. I just choose to name it event because that's what it is right now. But don't think there's magic to calling it event. I'm going to refresh the page, and now what I'm going to do is I'm going to type 55 and click guess, and it's going to say you got it, and we actually see the feedback. I'm going to guess 33, and obviously it says guess higher because we already got it. So now let's go ahead and finish this off. Let's make sure that once we get the number correct, we cannot guess again, so we don't get something weird like this. So I'm going to say at the beginning of the function, remember we have this game over variable that's true if we get it correct. So at the beginning, I'm going to say if game over equals true, then what we're going to do is we're going to return. We're going to return the function early. And here's another thing we should do. Let's see. We should also make sure that the number of guesses has not been exceeded. So let's use this guesses variable. Every single time we get guesses wrong, we're going to add 1 to guesses, which you can just do by saying guesses plus plus, guesses plus plus. So every single time we get the guess wrong, we need to add 1 to guesses. And we're going to add another check. We're going to say if guesses is equal to max guesses, which is 6, this constant we created in the last video here. If we reach our maximum amount of guesses, then we need to say feedback.inner HTML equals out of guesses, and we'll say feedback.inner HTML or feedback.style.color equals red. There, so now we actually give some feedback for if our guesses have been exceeded, and we'll also return the function. Remember, return exits a function early. So if we already won the game, we want to exit the function early. We don't want to do any processing. If we've already used up all our guesses, we want to exit the function early. And with that, I'm going to do a little bit more. Actually, I forgot one other thing. We actually need to check out what happens when I put in something like hello in the guess box. It says you got it. Let's refresh the page. If I enter the word hello inside our text box and click guess, it says I got it right. Now, why did that happen? That makes no sense. Well, it's about the way the number function works. If the number function gets something like 33, well, it's going to give you 33. If the number function gets 33a, that's not a number, so it's going to give nan, not a number. So let's check out our if statements. If guess is less than number, well, guess is nan, so this doesn't happen. Else if guess is greater than number, well, guess is nan, so this doesn't happen. So this else executes. Because our guess was set to nan, because we got an invalid guess argument, it's going to pass through these first two if statements, and our game is going to think that we got it right just because we entered it wrong. So what we need to do is very easy fix. Just change this to an else if guess equals number. which remember number was the randomly generated number we created. I'm just reminding you of the variable since we created these all like over a week ago. So guess equals number. Then that's going to prevent that problem from happening again. So now let's refresh the page, make sure it works. I'm going to put hello, and nothing happens. We do not get any credit for that, but we also don't use up a guess either, which I kind of like because that, keeps you from making a mistake and losing a guess. Now let's make sure that everything is working. I'm going to refresh the page. I'm going to type in 30, guess higher. Okay, so I'm going to guess 60. Let's run out of guesses. I want to see it say you ran out of guesses. Out of guesses, and notice even if I type in 55 now, doesn't matter because the guesses have been exceeded. Let's refresh one more time, type in 55, and it is working. And that is your completed number guessing game. I know we did a lot of restructuring. In fact, our code ends here. We don't need any of this code down here. We can go ahead and delete that. But again, that code wasn't wasted. That was the best possible number guessing game that we could add with the prompt function. But now we learned about a better way of getting user input using a text box and then checking for the submit event so we can process that text box. So that concludes this video, and thank you for watching.